Mr. Cotroni, it has been alleged that you are the head of the Montreal Mafia.
Oh, no. I'm the head of nobody. I'm head myself, that's all.
Well, they said that you were the godfather of the Mafia.
Godfather, right?
It's not true?
No. Me just came here to see my sister, that's all.
In the realm of Canadian organized crime, one name struck terror into the hearts of many. Vincenzo Cotroni. This mini-documentary unveils Cotroni's journey from his modest beginnings in Calabria, Italy, to his emergence as a dominant force in Montreal's Mafia. Along the way, he formed a significant connection with the renowned figure, Carmine Galante. Their alliance would shape Cotroni's path and solidify his position in the criminal underworld. Step into the enigmatic world of Vincenzo Cotroni as we explore his story of ambition, strategic brilliance, and a legacy that continues to reverberate through the annals of organized crime. Vincenzo Cotroni was born in 1911 in Mamela, Calabria, Italy. In 1924, when he was 14 years old, he immigrated with his parents, Nicodemo and Maria Cotroni, to the U.S., briefly stopping over in New York before heading north to Montreal, Quebec, Canada. They resided in a 3-story brick row house on the corner of Ontario and St. Timothy Streets in Montreal's notable Italian neighborhood. Vincenzo and his parents became naturalized Canadians in 1929. During the 1920s and 1930s, Vincenzo and his father were constantly in trouble with the law for bootlegging offenses. Nicodemo also landed in trouble for an altercation with a female liquor inspector, illegal possession of alcohol, theft, and the possession of stolen goods. Vincenzo never attended school, and after they settled in Montreal, the family had grown to 8 members, his brothers Giuseppe, Michele, and Frank, and his sisters Palmina and Marguerite. When Vincenzo was 18 years old, he was arrested on a charge for violating a teenage girl by the name of Maria Bresciano. However, after he posted bail of $1,000, the charges were dropped when she agreed to marry him and would remain married for the rest of his life. A few months later, he was jailed for 30 days for illegally selling alcohol, and in 1931, he was convicted of passing a bad check. In 1934, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison for possessing counterfeit money, which he later admitted consisted of only 2 bogus 50-cent pieces. He worked as a carpenter for his father before becoming a professional wrestler under the ring name Vic Vincent, during which wrestler Armand Courville trained him. Not only was Courville a wrestler and a trainer, but he also allegedly had a hand in several illegal business ventures. It was Courville who introduced Vincenzo to the seedier side of Montreal, and they remained friends and associates for the rest of his life. In what they called baseball bat elections, he and Courville were paid by the Liberal Party and the Union Nationale to clear balloting rooms and stuff ballot boxes for their opponents. In 1936, Vincenzo was found guilty of assaulting an election officer. This would be his last conviction for almost 4 decades. In 1947, Courville and Cotroni partnered with Marseilles-born brothers Edmond and Marius Martin to open the Cabaret au Faisan Doré, or in English, Golden Pheasant, at the corner of St. Laurent Boulevard and St. Catherine Street. The night spot grew in popularity because of its star MC, Jacques Normand, and performances by celebrities such as Charles Aznavour and Luis Mariano. However, this would not be Vincenzo's way of making his fortune. This would be earned through rackets such as prostitution, gambling, and bookmaking. The proximity to New York, the introduction of modern telecommunications technology, and the abrupt crackdown on illicit gambling soon drew U.S. criminal organizations, with Vincenzo serving as their man. Throughout the late 1940s, Luciano's narcotics network was big and complex. He had many of his old deported allies help him run his empire. The main drug imported by Luciano's network at the time was heroin, and the main sources were French underworld clans that made up the core of the French mob. One of the powerful bosses of the Corsican clan supplying Luciano and his mafia allies with large amounts of heroin was Antoine D'Agostino, and his mailing address in Montreal was the nightclub owned by Vincenzo Cotroni. However, on September 14, 1949, Antoine D'Agostino was arrested by an undercover agent buying 32 ounces of heroin from him. Officers from the RCMP's narcotics branch searched the club's phone records for information on D'Agostino's contacts and discovered that multiple calls had been made to New York, notably to Sebastiano Bellanca, a Gambino family member and notorious drug trafficker. Harry Shipp, known as the King of the Montreal Gamblers, was a big bookmaker and operator of clandestine casinos throughout the city. Despite not graduating, he excelled in his studies, especially mathematics, and was well liked by his peers. He converted several apartments on St. Catherine Street into bookmakers' offices in 1940, outfitting them with telegraph machines. The tickers broadcast live results from horse races and other sporting events across the United States and Canada. In just 6 years, the premises were raided 34 times, and Shipp would pay the fines without complaint, and operations would resume where they had left off. Shipp's legacy in Montreal may be the introduction of New York's Cosa Nostra, when he appeared to have owed money to Frank ERICKSON, the East Coast's wealthiest bookie, whose silent partners included Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Lucky Luciano. As a result, Shipp was compelled to accept the meddling of the New York families in the early 1950s due to his debt. The American bosses assigned 2 émigré mobsters in Montreal, Sicilian Luigi Greco and Ukrainian Frank Petrola, to take care of Shipp. Greco and Petrola had been bodyguards for Harry Davis, a Jewish mobster who ran Montreal's underworld for a year before he was shot to death in one of his betting emporiums in 1946. After Davis's murder, they hooked up with Vincenzo and his brother Giuseppe Cotroni and took over some of Davis's rackets. Meanwhile, in the late 1940s, another mafioso named Carmine Galante, commonly known as Lilo, also began looking north to Montreal. After he allegedly murdered Carlo Tresca, an Italian-American newspaper editor, orator, and labor organizer, in 1943, his reputation shot up in the underworld, becoming a made man in the Bonanno crime family. By the 1950s, branch plants in auto, radio, and appliance manufacturing began appearing in Canada, and Galante wanted to do the same thing with organized crime for his boss, Joe Bonanno. He arrived in 1953 with a dreadful reputation, top-level mob connections, and a desire to escape the unrelenting attention brought on by the Kefauver hearings on organized crime in the United States. His task was to push the Bonanno family's operations northward. Galante saw Montreal as having immense potential for the American underworld and sought to make it the focal point of the drug trade. He worked out of an electronics firm guarded by the former gunman for Murder Incorporated and legendary boxing promoter Frankie CARBO. Galante was soon collecting protection money from underworld gambling dens and after-hours drinking establishments also known as blind pigs. At the time, Vincenzo Cotroni was regarded as significant, however not the dominant force in Montreal's criminal underworld, but his nightclub in the city's Tenderloin district had attracted judges, lawyers, and politicians. Luigi Greco was known to be close to Carmine Galante, and thus possibly, Vincenzo's relationship with Galante grew from this connection to a point where he became a godfather to one of Galante's children, and vice versa. Soon Galante established a Bonanno family decina, swearing in several members and his chief lieutenants being Luigi Greco and Vincenzo Cotroni. In 1954, Galante sent Greco and Petrola to Italy to meet Lucky Luciano. However, upon Frank Petrola's return, police raided his home and discovered a journal containing a list of municipal politicians and journalists who had been bribed a total of $100,000 to defeat the then mayoral candidate Jean Drapeau, who was a reformer against the mob. Drapeau still won the election, however, Petrola was never forgiven for this sloppiness, and it was feared he might start cooperating with authorities. Soon, he was missing and presumed dead. Rumor has it that Greco, whose public face was being a pizzeria owner at the time, ran his body through a meat grinder. The Drapeau years did not run the mob out of Montreal. However, in 1955, Galante was summoned by the RCMP, Immigration and Revenue Office, to explain what he did for a living. Unable to provide information, Galante was deported, but he then sent his brother-in-law, Antonio Morelli, to handle affairs. However, he too would be deported. Joe Bonanno replaced Galante with Salvatore Little Salgilio, but by 1957 he was deported when police found 240 illegal Cuban cigars and 880 American cigarettes in his possession, which he failed to declare to customs. Joe Bonanno then appointed Vincenzo Cotroni as his Montreal agent. In the book, Blood Brothers, How Canada's Most Powerful Mafia Family Runs Its Business, Peter Edwards wrote that Cotroni was just a glorified branch plant manager who took his orders from New York, and that the Cotroni family was only the Canadian decina of the Bonanno family of New York, instead of being a crime family in its own right. In 1964, Cotroni was faced with a dilemma when his boss, Joseph Bonanno, challenged the commission, the governing board of the American Mafia. Allegedly, in 1963, Bonanno made plans to assassinate several rivals on the Mafia Commission, bosses Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, and Stefano Magadino. Bonanno sought Profaci crime family boss Joseph Magliocco's support, who in turn gave the contract to one of his top hit men, Joseph Colombo. However, the opportunistic Colombo revealed the plot to its targets. Bonanno was summoned to the commission to explain himself, but instead fled to Montreal. Cotroni was forced to choose between serving his boss, Bonanno, and the commission, both of whom he wished to be loyal to, when Bonanno arrived unexpectedly. New Jersey boss Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante was dispatched north to Montreal to request that Bonanno return to New York, only for Bonanno to announce that he no longer recognized the commission's authority. Cotroni fell under pressure in his efforts to remain neutral when Magadino interpreted Bonanno's presence in Montreal as an intention to move into his territory of southern Ontario, leading to threats from Buffalo that Cotroni should distance himself from Bonanno if he wanted to live. However, to Cotroni's relief, Bonanno was deported from Canada in the summer of 1964. On November 28, 1966, a delegation of New York Mafia leaders led by Bonanno's son, Salvatore Bonanno, together with Carl Semari, Peter Magadino, Vito De Filippo, Peter Notaro, and Pat De Filippo arrived in Montreal to talk with Cotroni about the upcoming Expo 67. They were pulled over near the corner of Jean Talon and Hutchinson Streets. The police found 3 loaded revolvers. However, Salvatore Bonanno was only charged $25 for driving without the proper registration. Even though each of the associates gave their occupation as chauffeur during the charges, immigration officers forced the Americans to turn back to New York. Stefano Magadino was furious when he heard about the intended Bonanno-Cotroni meeting, leading Cotroni to send a message that the meeting had not been planned by him. After Magadino offered to see Cotroni in Buffalo with regard to the matter at hand, Cotroni declined. Giacomo Lupino of Hamilton, who was one of the few people Magadino respected, intervened when the Buffalo boss told Cotroni that he was replaceable. Lupino managed to confuse, downplay, and otherwise stifle Magadino's murderous rampage, merely because his daughter, Grazia, was married to fast-rising mobster Paolo Violi, who was in the Vincenzo Cotroni mob at the time. Magadino considered Violi as his beachhead in Montreal, who would eventually allow him to annex Quebec to his Canadian territories, weakening his despised rivals, the Bonanno family. Violi, for his part, despised both Bonanno and Magadino. In a 1967 phone call, wiretapped by the police, Violi recommended to Lupino's son, Jimmy, that the Cotroni family ought to declare independence and establish itself as a crime family in its own right. During the Banana Split years, Vincenzo Cotroni made a point of remaining impartial. Cotroni had risen through the mob ranks following Galante's forced departure to the United States a decade earlier, becoming the sole leader of the Bonanno family's decina in Montreal and demoting the Sicilian Luigi Greco to the rank of lieutenant. But a blaze was erupting, and Montreal, like New York, would soon be on fire.